Inside the lobby of a building on Broad Street in Manhattan, the shoe shine boy finished buffing a customer's left shoe. He slapped the clean cloth on his hand and leaned back, admiring his work. He spoke brightly. "Mr. Hale, you should buy Radio Corporation today. Everyone says it'll double by Christmas." Charles Cavendish Hale did not look down. He kept his eyes on the ticker tape sliding from the brass machine beside his chair. The numbers chattered like teeth in winter. Hale was naturally skeptical. He said, "Everyone? That's rarely right." The boy frowned. "My uncle bought on margin. Says it's free money. He always borrows. Says anyone would be mad not to." Hale paid the kid double, stood up, and walked into the building without another word. That afternoon, September 12, 1929, he instructed his broker to liquidate the last of his long positions. By the closing bell, Charles Hale was almost entirely in cash. He had never felt more comfortable or relaxed. He was ready. At 46 years of age and impeccably dressed, Charles Hale was well regarded on Wall Street. Some thought him dull but dependable, a typical Englishman. He knew he was reserved. He also knew Americans thought he was stuffy. He never boasted, never speculated in public, never chased the market's latest darling. His office overlooked Broad Street, but he had barely looked out his window over the last few months. His attention was fixed on credit figures, margin debt, bond yields, and foreign currency flows. While others watched prices, Hale watched pressure. He was focused on signals rather than noise. Hale had seen it before, not in New York, but in London 22 years earlier, as a junior clerk during the Panic of 1907. He had learned then that markets did not collapse because of fear. They collapsed because of debt. By the summer of 1929 in the United States, debt was everywhere. Investment trusts were borrowing to buy shares in other investment trusts. Brokers were lending to secretaries and chauffeurs. Banks were extending credit as casually as they would hand out cigars to their wealthy clients. Hale read Federal Reserve circulars the way priests read scripture. When rates crept from 5 to 6%, he heard a door closing. He knew what that sound meant. When British banks quietly sold American holdings in September, an old friend in London sent him a cable. Hale took the warning seriously. Every time corporate insiders filed sale notices, he clipped them and filed them away. When bond prices rose while stocks climbed, he smiled grimly. It made no sense. And when a shoeshine boy offered him stock advice, Hale knew the hour was late. By October the 20th, he had done more than sell. He had begun to bet against the market. His broker was incredulous. "Short? Now?" Hale nodded. "Do it slowly. Focus on banks and investment trusts. And don't forget consumer luxuries." His broker was breathless. "But the newspapers are saying..." Hale interrupted him. "The newspapers are written for those who buy stories. I buy arithmetic." On October the 24th, the market stumbled. On the 28th, it bled. That Monday morning, Hale arrived at his office before dawn. His private line crackled with updates from Chicago, Boston, and London. Selling pressure was heavy but orderly, exactly as he had expected. Professional hustlers were happily distributing stock to foolish optimists. At 10:30, Hale increased his short positions. By noon, margin calls were flooding brokerage houses. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, prices were sliding faster than anyone could react to. Hale did not raise his voice once. He simply nodded, confirmed, and executed. Across Wall Street, panic erupted. In Hale's office on Broad Street, there was only cold calculation. That night, while Manhattan dined and danced, in the hope that this was simply a correction, Hale sat alone, studying ledgers and cables. European money was fleeing. Gold was rising. Banks were tightening credit to their weakest borrowers. He placed 3 more calls and went home before midnight. October 29th arrived like a guillotine being rolled into place on Wall Street. The opening bell rang to a roar of sell orders. Prices collapsed in gaps. Ticker tape lagged minutes behind reality. Men shouted. Some wept. A few fainted. Hale's fortune multiplied with every point the Dow lost. By 11 o'clock that morning, Hale was one of the richest men in New York, at least on paper. At noon, a clerk burst into his office. "Sir, National Atlantic Trust has suspended payments." Hale closed his eyes briefly. He knew that National Atlantic held millions in margin loans. Rubbing his hand thoughtfully across his lips, he said, "Expected. Reduce exposure to correspondent banks." At 2 o'clock, another message arrived. Federal Reserve, meeting in emergency session. Hale stood, straightened his cuffs, and made one final call. He gave his chief assistant a clear command. Cover half the shorts by closing. Leave the rest open overnight. The young man hesitated. "Sir, prices may fall further." Hale gazed at him with a slight hint of malice. "They will, but tomorrow will be a different game." That evening, the city was silent, in a way Hale had never known. No laughter, no honking car horns, only the distant hum of disbelief. He asked his driver to let him out a few blocks before his apartment on the 20th floor of the San Remo on Central Park West. He needed to breathe the air. He walked the rest of the way. When Hale pushed through the main doors, the concierge recognized him and handed him an envelope. Hale opened it and unfolded a telegram. "Account review required. Urgent. Federal Trust Bank." There was a telephone number at the bottom of the document. He frowned. Federal Trust was solid, conservative. He held a substantial deposit of cash at Federal Trust for that reason. He rang the number immediately in the telephone booth in the lobby of the San Remo. After several clicks, a familiar voice answered. Hale said, "Edward, your telegram?" There was a pause that was a little too long. Edward Latham said, "We have a problem. A temporary liquidity issue." Hale spoke evenly. "How temporary?" Latham said, "We extended loans on securities. When the market..." He couldn't complete his sentence because Hale interrupted him. "Margin loans?" Edward said. "Yes." Hale spoke urgently. "To whom?" There was a pause. Hale felt something close to exhilaration, but he fought against expressing it. "Edward?" Latham whispered. "Investment trusts, I'm afraid. Several of them. We are heavily leveraged." Hale closed his eyes. Federal Trust was his fortress. He could barely believe what he was hearing. "How much are you exposed?" Edward's mouth went dry. "More than we can absorb." Hale asked the obvious question, without a moment's hesitation. "Are you insolvent?" Edward Latham nervously tapped his cigarette in an ashtray. "Not yet, but if withdrawals accelerate tomorrow..." Hale cut across him. "They will." Latham exhaled. "We need capital. Tonight." Hale understood instantly. His shorts would pay out magnificently, but only if counterparties survived to honor them. Cash in a failing bank was a promise written on nothing more substantial than smoke. But he already knew this. Hale said, "How long before the regulators step in?" Edward drew deeply on his cigarette. "Hours, maybe less." Hale looked at the telegram again, then at his watch. He said, "I'll be there." Hale arrived at Federal Trust's headquarters a few minutes after 9 o'clock that night. The boardroom was full of men who looked exhausted. Some looked ill. Papers lay scattered like fallen leaves across the table. When he entered, one was speaking desperately to the others. "We can pledge assets." Another shook his head. "No one will lend." Hale took a seat at the head of the table, which someone had recently vacated. He spoke calmly. "Gentlemen, I will provide sufficient capital." Every head snapped toward him. "But there are conditions." Mouth slightly agape, Edward Latham seemed relieved but confused. "What are they?" Hale spoke like a king, quietly but with immense authority. "You will transfer to me the controlling interest in Federal Trust. At par, you will assign all outstanding margin loan claims to a new holding company under my control. and you will grant me the sole right to restructure before the market opens." One of the directors at the table could not hold back. He said, "That's extortion." Hale replied, "Rather, sir, it is basic arithmetic." Silence followed. At 10:47 that evening, a rapidly drawn-up agreement was signed by all the directors, even those with lingering doubts. When the market reopened later that morning, Federal Trust did not fail. Hale spent the day unwinding positions, covering shorts, and quietly acquiring assets at prices that had not been seen for a decade or more. By Friday, he had converted paper profits into something far more valuable. He had full control. 3 weeks later, while the nation reeled, Charles Cavendish Hale was summoned to Washington, D.C. President Coolidge's Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, studied him carefully. "You are English." It was an accusation rather than a question. Hale stood steady, unfazed. "I am." Mellon tightened his lips. "You have navigated the storm." Hale nodded slightly. "I prepared well. We English know about storms." The secretary moved slightly in his wooden swivel chair. "We need men like you. We need stability and discipline." Hale inclined his head. "To what end?" The secretary said, "To help rebuild from the inside." Hale tried to suppress his smile. He remembered that people thought he was stuffy. Years later, historians would marvel at how a financier emerged from the wreckage of 1929 wealthier than ever. They would credit it to pure luck. They were wrong. Charles Cavendish Hale had not merely survived the crash. He had ensured that the institution holding his cash would fail unless it belonged to him. After all, the smart money does not simply move first. It decides who falls and who remains standing when the last bell rings.